Now move to our final speaker in session B. That's Dr. Ellen McAdam, previously the director of Birmingham Museums Trust, but long associated with the archaeology of Mesopotamia, and with a specialism that she will talk to us today, the Ubaid period figurines from Ur. So we'll let Ellen join us, I hope.
Well, good afternoon. What follows is part of a work in progress. So I hope to raise more questions than I answer. In the 1980s, thanks largely to Nicholas Postgate, I carried out postdoctoral research on prehistoric Mesopotamian figurines in many museums from Baghdad to Philadelphia. And in total, I catalogued and drew around 400 figurines from about 20 sites. Real life then interfered with my publication plans, and now that I'm retired and mortgage-free, I'm able to resume them. This paper focuses on the figurines from the graves in Pit F at Ur. And everyone who's studied Mesopotamian archaeology knows what an Ubaid figurine looks like. It looks like this. They were first described by Sir Leonard Woolley at Ur in the 1920s. And this is U15385, one of two from Pit F, Grave T. In Ur, the early periods, Woolley writes, "The shoulders are unnaturally wide and angular, and on them and on the upper arms there are spots of black paint or small lumps of clay applied, undoubtedly to represent tattoo marks. The top of the skull rises in an elongated dome, which was originally covered in bitumen to represent hair. The rest of the head, unduly large, is absolutely reptilian in character. It is my opinion that the grotesqueness of the female figurine was deliberate and that the subject was some kind of half-human demon." And this description has been repeated for nearly 100 years. Having looked at over 100 Ubaid figurines and fragments, it is clear to me that the well-known examples from Ur were part of a wider and more complex phenomenon. In addition to recording details of manufacturing technique and decoration, I am now attempting to place these objects in their archaeological context. And this is complicated by three factors: the quality of recording and publication of previous excavations. Secondly, the fact that relatively few have been found in primary contexts. The complete examples with pellets described by Woolley and shown here are from graves, and comparable examples from other sites are also either from graves or from cemetery areas. These are massively outnumbered by fragments of painted figurines, which are from secondary or tertiary contexts, reflecting high levels of redeposition. And finally, of course, the depth of deposit at major Mesopotamian sites like Ur means that only a small area of Ubaid occupation can be explored, which means really that one has the frustrating sense of peering through a keyhole. Woolley excavated 14 pits in search of the early periods at Ur, and this slide shows the buildings in the Temenos area on the left, and on the right, a location plan of his test pits. The Royal Cemetery area is in the southeast corner for orientation. And I'm focusing today on the Ubaid figurines from the graves in Pit F in the southwest corner of the Temenos. Woolley selected this site, as one of the previous speakers said, because erosion had reduced the ground surface to a mere 18 meters above sea level. Out of 51 Ubaid human and animal figurines identified at Ur, 27 came from Pit F, over 50%, including all the complete figurines that were found. Of the other 24, 7 were from pits G, W, and X, and 17 were surface finds unprovenanced or from much later contexts. So pit F really has the best and most coherent assemblage. This is the section of pit F. Woolley excavated pit F to a depth of 1 metre below modern sea level to a heavy green clay. He argued that this was the bottom of the original marsh. Excuse me. Above this, he identified a layer of black organic mud, and above the mud was a layer of sand and grit containing some pottery, which he interpreted as the dried surface of the former marsh. Above this was layer 2, a layer of mixed domestic rubbish containing floors and surfaces, and the remains of mud brick and reed structures. All the pottery was Ubaid. And above this, at 1 to 2 metres to 4.5 to 5.5 metres above sea level, layer 3 consisted of a layer of consistent clean silt with an average thickness of 3.5 metres. Woolley initially identified this as the flood layer and a single deposition event. However, he later concludes that there had been 2 episodes of silt deposition. And above this silt deposit, Woolley identified the bottom of a 4th layer, which he referred to as the factory stratum. It consisted of an almost solid mass of wasters mixed with ashes from at least 14 kilns. According to the grave catalogue, there were 43 graves of the Ubaid or Ubaid to Uruk periods in pit F. Woolley believed that these belonged to 2 different phases. He suggests that the upper group of 10 graves was dug from the lower levels of layer 4, the factory level, and there were no figurines in this upper group. There were 33 graves in the lower group, 6 of which produced 7 figurines. And I have to apologise for the quality of this slide, which looks as if I had commissioned it from the preschool nursery group just down the road, but in fact it's my first stab done at the kitchen table at a distribution plot of the Ubaid graves in pit F. And what it mainly shows is that the activity is very much concentrated in the northwest corner of pit F. So it is possible to record the distribution of the graves by square within pit F. Woolley excavated and recorded pit F in 2.5 metre squares. Unfortunately, the location of the grave within the square can't be established. But what emerges is a complicated picture, much more complicated, for example, than the neatly arranged rows of graves in the cemetery at Eridu. So the highest concentration of burials is in square E7 in the northwest of the excavation, beside the stairs, and as is typical in all archaeological excavations, many of the most interesting burials were disappearing into the pit wall. E7 contains 16 burials. P7 to the south contained just 1, and E6 to the east contained 6, and the remaining 10 burials are distributed in 3 squares to the southwest, as if along a trackway or path of some kind. Woolley says that the grave cuts were difficult to define, and there's no sign of the Libyan boxes seen at Eridu. However, 6 graves were partially paved with sherds. The preservation of the bones generally poor, and in some graves there's no trace of a burial at all. But 8 graves, all in E7, contained more than 1 body. And where enough survived for the position of the body to be determined, 6 bodies lay extended with their hands over the pelvis, and 5 were flexed on their left sides. The head lay to the southwest in 7 cases, southeast in 1 and northeast in 1. And 7 graves contained more than 1 individual, all of these in square E7. All but 2 of the graves contained varying numbers of grave goods, mainly pots, and 6 graves contained 7 figurines, 4 in E7, 1 in E6, and 1 in D5. This shows the plans of grave AA on the left and grave T on the right. Grave T on the right is one of the most complex graves. It consisted of a rectangular trench about 3 by half a metre, according to 0.6 of a metre, according to Woolley, and it was half paved with sherds. It contained the remains of at least 3 bodies. The most complete lay with its head on the shared paving, and the plan indicates all 3 lying flexed on their left sides. They may represent successive burials. And grave U, which was adjacent to it and at a slightly higher level, contained a further 2 bodies and may have been part of the same sequence. The most complete burial had a bead bracelet on its right wrist, and by its hands in the pelvis area was a female figurine with pellets on its shoulders, 15379, and by the knees was a second figurine, which we have already seen, 15385, which is shown in the next slide. And I'm going to describe this one in some detail because although every Ubaid figurine is unique, this one illustrates a number of recurring features. The legs, body and head are formed from a single stalk of finely prepared clay, light buff in colour with a fine grit temper and white slip. And other features are applied to this stalk or created by modelling, carving, incision and painting. The neck is thick and the head projects forward slightly. The pointed crown of the head is covered by bituminous mastic, and with a hand lens one can see small brown organic inclusions. The facial features are in fact carved into a strip of clay wrapped around the central stalk. In this case, it's very well made. The join doesn't show, but in other figurines, the join is clearly visible. And the eyes are long, slanting, excised slits, deeply cut and sharply defined, with heavy, rounded ridges above. The cheek line is also sharp, running round the face to just below the mouth, which is formed by a single curving incision. The large, curving, blunted nose has 2 circular impressions indicating the nostrils. There's another impression between the nose and the mouth, and 2 more below the mouth and chin, and this again is a recurring feature. And these impressions are several millimetres deep and perhaps held organic insertions of some kind. The shoulders are very wide and angular, flat. There are applied pellets on the front and back of the shoulders. They're asymmetrical. There doesn't seem to be any particular distribution. The shoulders and arms were applied to the central stalk, and the arms are bent at the elbows so that the hands rest on the waist, and the fingers are indicated by incisions. The arms are cracked where the wrists join the arms to the body, and this is a very common feature on pellet figurines. Many of them are broken in this area, and sometimes the facial strip as well. And a ceramicist I consulted told me that, in her opinion, this indicates that the clay of the pieces that were applied had not sufficiently dried out before firing and therefore sprung during the firing. The breasts are small and pointed and separately applied. A shallow impression indicates the navel. The pubic triangle consists of a series of V's below a horizontal incised line, and the body slim with individually modelled rounded buttocks. The legs are extended and indicated front and back by incised lines, and the feet are together, and the figurine will not stand upright. And the other figurine in grave T, which is also in Philadelphia, was very similar, including the breakage in the hands wrist area. The main difference was that the eyes were picked out in black and there were traces of red paint on the cheeks. Grave AA, which we saw the plan of, also contained 2 burials, and this mother and child figurine was next to the second skull in very similar, apart from the presence of the baby, to the previous figurine. This example U15507 was from grave JJ, also in square E7, another 2-burial grave. The primary burial was extended with the hands and the pelvis, and the figurine was either above or actually held in the hands. Note, again, there's a problem with the hands coming detached from the body. In this grave, there was a lump of red hematite, and the second burial appeared to have been powdered with it. And this powdering also occurs in grave KK in E7. The association of red with the burials it's not constant, but it's fairly consistently recurring. Again in square E7, this is grave O. This mother and child figurine is the only example of a painted figurine from a grave. Unfortunately, this grave was one of the ones that ran into the side of the pit under the stairs and could not be fully excavated. The head of this figurine is missing. It may have been deliberately removed. And unlike the pellet examples, this figurine has a base on which it will stand upright. The painted decoration on the neck, shoulders, wrists, and waist is similar to many other fragments of painted figurines, female figurines. And the collar around the neck with 2 ties at the back is an almost invariable feature of painted female figurines. And note, or rather touchingly, that the baby is also decorated. This is grave O in square D5, another pellet example. Another example where problems have occurred in firing, not only with the left arm, but with the applied space, the applied face strip, but also note that you can still see the holes in the lower lip. The last example of a pellet figurine is slightly different from these previous ones. This is square E6, grave QQ, and the fragment in the top row was found in this grave. It's different from the other pellet figurines at Ur in several ways. The face is more rounded. It was applied as a round pellet to the front of the neck rather than a strip wound round it. The shape of the eyes, nose and mouth is slightly more naturalistic than in the other pellet figurines from Ur. The eyes were picked out in crimson. It still has the deep impressions in the upper and lower lip. The top of the head was broken off, but it appears to have continued the line of the neck in a conical shape, a feature which occurs in other, possibly early figurines. And the left arm, which is all that survives, rather than being the huge square rugby-playing shoulder of the other figurines, is covered in pellets. It's like a fin, a little rounded fin covered in pellets pressed together. This was found as a fragment in the grave, and this may indicate that it was disturbed in the process of grave digging, but deliberately redeposited, which indicates that it may be stratigraphically earlier than the other pellet figurines. So in summary, most pellet figurines and all the complete examples are found in graves or cemetery areas. They're mainly female, occasionally nursing an infant, and there are occasional examples of male figurines, for example, from Eridu and Oweli. The pellet figurines are not made to stand upright, and many of them are damaged, particularly in the hands waist area. Pellet figurines are greatly outnumbered by fragments of painted figurines. In addition to the standing wide-shouldered females, There are seated females. There are bearded male figurines in skirts, often bending forward slightly and shown with little headdresses. There are animal figurines, which include bovids, birds, dogs, and completely unidentifiable species. The painted figurines tend to be found in the vicinity of temples, and only one, the one I have just shown you, is from a grave. And at Eridu, there were none from the area of domestic occupation. So the questions I have are, do the supine pellet figurines represent the dead person, or another dead person, or a supernatural being who was entitled to be buried with a pellet figurine? Does it indicate a particular status, or the circumstances of death, or both? These are exceptionally well-made and modelled objects. Nevertheless, there's a consistent problem with the firing, particularly with the hands, and this technical fault is not seen in painted examples. Does this mean that the pellet examples were made in a hurry? Were they perhaps made to order on the occasion of a death? The more rounded natural features and less angular shoulders seen in the grave QQ fragment reflect similar features and fragments found elsewhere and at other sites. And the painted example at the bottom of this slide is another example of what appears to be an earlier type. It's from the lower silt level in pit F. Together, these fragments suggest that what Woolley called the grotesque lizard-headed Ubaid pellet figurines from graves evolved from a tradition of more naturalistic painted Samarran figurines found at sites like Tel Songor and Chogamami. And that the way in which human beings were depicted in the Ubaid became progressively more and more stylized over time. And finally, I'd just like to leave you with one image. As far as the grotesque is concerned, human beauty is very much in the eye of the human beholder. The proportions of the body and face of this 1980s Barbie doll are very similar to those of Ubaid figurines. But we don't bury them, we give them to little girls to play with.
Alan, thank you very much for that fantastic talk. Takes us into the world of Ubaid figurines. I'm sure there will be questions for you, and please do use the Q&A box if you have them. I would like to ask a question, if I may, given there's none in the box so far. I was just interested in your thoughts about the figurines being related as expressions of the dead person. And I suppose, is it possible to say anything about the gender of the owners of the grave from the other content, from the other material in the grave?
Not as far as I know, and at Ur, none of the graves has been assigned a gender on the basis of skeletal evidence. The skeletal evidence just wasn't good enough. I haven't really looked at the pottery in detail, but nobody's ever suggested that you can tell the gender of a grave. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about Ur is how many people there are in these graves. They're quite overcrowded, some of them.
So the figurines could relate to specific roles as much as perhaps gender.
They might, and also it's not always very clear which, if any, of the burials in a particular grave they belong to. So it's quite a complicated process of reconstruction, I think.
Yeah, and I was interested also in your evolution of the figurine from the earlier Samarran figures. Are there any figures from graves? I mean, do we have graves from earlier? So that relationship between the dead is also is a continuity.
Yes, I think there's one Samarran figurine from a grave. I mean, unfortunately, quite a lot of the Samarran sites are unpublished, and even more unfortunately, when I was working in Baghdad, even the great Haji Abid couldn't find the figurines from Togamami, so I've never seen them in the flesh. But I'm hoping to work backwards from the Ubaid into the Samarran period.
Right, and that in many ways was going to be my next question: is where are your next steps? Where are you heading with these?
Yes, I started with Ur and Eridu during lockdown because I had the excavation reports, and now I'm working backwards in time.
Fantastic, great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that incredibly illuminating talk. Opening up again all sorts of new avenues for pursuit from these excavated objects from nearly a century ago or so. So very grateful for your contribution to the colloquium. Thank you, Ellen.